of the things that I see companies struggling with in the likes of the UK or the USA, those sorts of cultures, is how do you deal with agile contracts? Because we like to have this idea of this is what's going to be delivered, this is the budget by this time, which is causing this tension around how we do agile. And you look at a culture like those in Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, etc. Their mindset is almost there already because it's all about we're building up a trustful relationship with you, and the contract is kind of not as important as, like I say, building up that relationship for the longer term.
Welcome to the Product Agility Podcast, the missing link between Agile and product. The purpose of this podcast is to share practical tips, strategies, and stories from world-class thought leaders and practitioners. Why, I hear you ask? Well, I want to increase your knowledge and your motivation to experiment so that together we can create ever more successful products. My name is Ben Maynard, and I'm your host. What has driven me for the last decade to bridge the gap between agility and product is a deep-rooted belief that people and products evolving together can achieve mutual excellence.
And we are joined for 2 episodes by author, Scrum expert, and product team collaboration guru, David Spinks. David is the co-author of 2 books, Mastering Collaboration Within a Product Team and Agile Across Borders. And it is that topic, Agile Across Borders, that we are going to focus on in this first episode. As always, think of someone to recommend this episode to. It's a fantastic insight into how to make collaboration work across geographic borders. Let's begin the episode.
Hello, welcome to yet another episode of my lovely podcast. Today we are joined by Mr. David Spinks. David is an author. He is a professional Scrum trainer and an accredited Kanban trainer. And I've wanted him on the podcast because some of his books tickled my fancy. I liked the topics. I like what he was writing, and I think we met on LinkedIn or some other internet-based thing. And so here we are for one of 2 episodes where we're going to be exploring a couple of topics which we have agreed upon in advance, which will mean we will definitely not change our minds or deviate from the agreed upon topics. Probably means we will deviate from them, but let's begin. Let's get the show on the road, shall we, and find out what they are. David, welcome. It's lovely to have you here.
Thank you, Ben. Lovely to be here.
It's
Thank
a
you for
pleasure.
inviting me.
Always happy to have a clever person on the podcast. It balances out my stupidity. Now,
I don't know about that.
Well, I shall prove to you. The levels to my stupidity. Stupidity knows no bounds. Now, David, I always feel massively inadequate when we have an author on. So thank you very much for giving me that gift. Because I've never written a book. And you've written, if I go into Amazon, so many books you've written.
Don't let Amazon fool you. Coincidentally, I just happen to have one of these names which is shared with another author. So it's good for cross sells, but there is another David Spinks out there that is an author and has published other books in the business space. But I can't claim to be as prolific as maybe you think I am, Ben.
Oh, I don't know. How many books have you written?
2 have been published, and there is 1 due out later this year, God willing. So hopefully we'll have.
So what are your 2 currently published books? I would read them out, but this one. It's got a long title. Right, so I would have got it wrong. Adopting Agile Across Borders, a guide to navigating cultural complexity in agile teams and organizations.
I'm just glad that you read that one out. So adopting Agile Across Borders for short. So sometimes I forget the title. Yeah. So that was my first book. Yes. The second book is called Mastering Collaboration in a Product Team. You talked about the book writing process. I think coming up with titles is maybe one of the challenging aspects. So if you ever become an author, Ben, then that's something to focus on. Coming up with your titles, that's a tricky challenge.
I'd love to write a book. I'd also like to learn to play the piano. Neither of which I don't think will ever happen because I have never found a way to prioritize it enough. How do you find time to write books?
It's a good question. I think part of it is kind of just having an idea and just going through it and not fully thinking through the consequences of what you might be signing up for. And look, it's a bit like the Agile process itself. Especially for the first book, there was a lot of research that went behind it. And when we started the journey that led to the book, the end goal was never a book in the first place. It was about learning, it was understanding, it was some research that myself and my partner wanted to do. And it was only on the journey that there were suggestions coming up that, hey, you've got some good insights here, some interesting stories. Have you thought about writing the book? I was like, okay, that might not be a bad idea. So again, things just kind of snowball, and it's a little bit like life, really. You don't know, kind of just takes you places that you didn't really plan for sometimes.
Now, you mentioned your partner, your writing partner, or is it your life partner?
Both. So we met a few years ago. So we were both working as Scrum Masters in the same organization. And yeah, kind of just started chatting. So yeah, she works in the Agile space as well. So Glaudia Califano is her name. She's also a Scrum.org trainer. Yeah,
That
my
is
business and life
phenomenal.
partner. Yeah, so that's Glaudia.
No, right there, that is. I'm happy to end this episode here. Thank everyone for listening. I love that. What a story. So, book number 1 was Adopting Agile Across Borders. Book number 2 was about collaboration tips for product teams. Today, what we wanted to explore was, I suppose, the premise of that first book and how it came into existence, and maybe some interesting exploration into cultural complexity. Now, before we do that, though, would you mind giving our listeners a little bit of an intro into yourself? I mean, I know we've already covered some pretty interesting stuff, but is there anything else you think it's worthwhile sharing with people listening?
I know, it feels like we kind of jumped straight. We already know about my life partner already, don't we? So so exactly. What else do you need to know? Yeah, so I've worked in the Agile space since around about 2012. I was a software developer before that, but yeah, I did that for about 10 years before I got into the Agile space. What else? Yeah, as well as my life partner that you found out about, you should also probably know that I've got 2 little dogs. So if you hear any barking in the background, or if I say something weird, then I'm probably talking to the dogs if I start shouting. Like,
Yeah,
shut up!
or me, maybe. Let's see.
Well, it depends if you say anything stupid, Ben.
I will, as I said, it knows no bounds. Now, let's crack into it, shall we? Because I did a live stream a few months ago now about conflict. And what we had on the live stream was an interesting conversation because there's one person who grew up in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, and just talking about some of the differences between just a made-up line effectively between a country, and how the effect that had on conflict and the cultural differences. And then there was also somebody from South Africa who was there during apartheid, and again talking about cultural differences. And I think that one thing that has kind of dawned on me over the years is that the way that I used to explain culture and the way that I dismissed cultural differences was really naive. And it's only been thanks to a couple of people, gentlemen, predominantly someone who kicked me off on this whole challenging of my thinking was a guy called Robert John, who is a good friend of mine, helped it open my eyes a little bit. And so discovering you, David, and discovering your book, I find this quite intriguing. So I would love to hear, I suppose, in some level of, detail, what were some of the experiences then to begin you to think, okay, here's something I want to learn about, here's something I want to write about?
So we mentioned my partner, and going back to when we first met, so she's originally from the Netherlands, and she moved to the UK. And like I say, we met when we were both working as Scrum Masters in the same company. And we just started getting into conversations around some of the little observations that she had coming to the UK as a Dutch person, the little cultural quirks that a lot of English people might have. For example, we use something called British coded speech a lot. We'll say things like interesting, or like that, or we'll say something like, I'm going to get back to you on that. Now, you and I know that that means I'm not going to get back to you on
Yeah,
that. That's a dismissive way without,
exactly. It's a very
yeah,
polite way of saying, I'm never going to raise that topic with you ever again.
precisely. Now, the Dutch are a very, very direct people. So if you say to a Dutch person, I'm going to get back to you on that, they get very excited. They think that they're taking your suggestion really seriously and you are genuinely going to get back. If you say, interesting, they genuinely believe that you're interested. Now, if you think about the Netherlands and the UK, we're just separated by this little stretch of water. If we can kind of fall into these little misunderstandings, what does it mean when, for the type of work that we do, with teams that need to be collaborative, working closely together, building shared understanding, empathy with our customers, our users, empathy with each other as teammates. So we kind of got into these conversations, myself and Claudia, around what impacts will culture have on agile adoption, especially in the world that we're in, where we've got diversity of teams, we've got offshoring, nearshoring. Prior to 2020, we were in a globalized world and it was easy for people to move to different countries. So we've got very diverse teams out there. So what does it mean for that diversity, those cultural differences, and something like Agile, which is very sort of dependent on these collaborative teams and how we communicate with each other? So that's how the conversation started. And we started looking out for, has anybody done any studies on this? And we found like one or two scientific papers, and a couple of people had looked at something like the Hofstadter model, which looks at cultural differences, but nobody had kind of done any field research, and we were kind of at the point where maybe we should do something.
So let me just interject there for a second. You mentioned agile organizations. I'm guessing that then this is also applicable to broader change initiatives. Any large shift in the shape or ethos, culture of an organization is just as relevant for that as it is for agile.
Yeah, absolutely. Although, I mean, this was our background and this is where we were coming from, and hence the title of the book, Agile Across Borders. But yeah, a lot of what we were looking at, you could say, it's relevant for any organizations where the work that they do depends on groups of people working together, teams of people working together. So yeah, I would say it's definitely relevant.
Do you find there was any link between geographical proximity and the ability and the level to which cultures were similar or dissimilar? So, for example, you mentioned between us and the Netherlands, say us in the UK and the Netherlands, a narrow stretch of water, but led to significant cultural differences. Did you ever happen across any information or data that suggested that actually the more you decrease the proximity, the bigger the cultural differences become?
Like anything, it's not that simple. There's a lot of complexities involved, and this is when if you look at the book, we've kind of written it in a way where it's almost like a travel guide, because we talk about the history of the country as well, because that is not just geography, but history can play a part. If you look at like a country like the Philippines, they were very influenced in their culture by Spain. Because of their history. They were also very influenced by the US, who after the Second World War was kind of like had a big influence on them. So a very different culture in the Philippines compared to maybe some of their neighbors because of that history as well. So yeah, geography plays a part, but when you look at something like culture, there are many factors that influence it, and geography is one. So yeah, you can see some patterns, but yeah, there's lots of other moving parts.
Yeah, so there's no rule for it.
Yeah, and like I say, it's a big eye opener as part of our research. Like I say, we visited a lot of these places that feature in the book, going in with again, hopefully with our eyes open, just to sort of be open to what people had to say and how they would behave, etc. So
you began this journey and it ended up being a physical journey. Then you traveled to these countries, and did you spend time with kind of teams in agile organizations or just teams more generally? How did you conduct it?
we left the UK. This is back in 2018, and the plan was we're going to take 6 months out and just start approaching companies and agile practitioners in different parts of the world. We actually started in South America. And yeah, we would just contact people on LinkedIn, contact companies, and just ask, we're kind of doing this research project. We're interested in culture. Can we come and interview you? Can we observe some of the teams in action? And over time, people that we were talking to were kind of interested and excited by what we were doing, and they would recommend that we visited other companies as well. So a lot of them were agile companies, but yeah, there were other companies as well that were kind of maybe not so much featured on agile per se in itself, but kind of just interested in what we were doing and thought, this could be a good company to talk to.
Or did you find anything which kind of was a common patterns or characteristics in teams that weren't able to make that cross-cultural teamwork effective?
So there's definitely challenges and patterns that are kind of common to a lot of agile teams and organizations, but there's definitely sort of cultural specific things that maybe we kind of take for granted in some parts of the world and others. So there's lots of examples, and I could probably talk about this.
Well, you
for
wrote a
hours.
book on it. I should hope you could talk for hours.
But for example, well, yeah, I could write a book on it. Yeah, exactly. So for example, in the UK, we're quite, part of our culture is we're quite transactional. And if I compare that to perhaps some of the cultures in South America, where a lot of what they do is very relationship driven. And a UK company, for example, we want to have a contract in place, provide a service, get paid for it. But in somewhere like South America, it's about building that long-term sort of relationship between client and supplier, for example. So there's a lot less formality perhaps around contracts, because if we look at, one of the things that I see companies struggling with in the likes of the UK or the USA, those sorts of cultures, is how do you deal with agile contracts? Because we like to have this idea of this is what's going to be delivered, this is the budget by this time, which is causing this tension around how we do agile, right? And you look at a culture like those in Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, etc. Their mindset is almost there already, because it's all about, we're building up a trustful relationship with you, and the contract is kind of not as important as, like I say, building up that relationship for the longer term.
Could you infer from that, or did you find data to suggest that then people in South America, let's say, are more comfortable with ambiguity, more trusting perhaps than their European counterparts?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of South American companies that provide services to like the US clients, and again, you've kind of got that contract in place. But when they're working internally within like South America, they wouldn't have a contract. They'd have more like an informal working agreement, and it would be something like, this is the goal that we want to achieve, and this is our budget. It buys so much time from the provider. They would have things written into their working agreement, like client availability to answer questions, those sorts of things. Here's the team, here's the tools that we're going to use. But any talk of this is the thing that I want delivered by this date, that just wasn't there really. It was more about, like I say, setting the scene around what do we want to achieve. This is how much budget we've got. Let's just see where it takes us. So of course that's a lot more ambiguous than having that sort of set in stone contract.
So there are some cultures out there that are more interested in building a longer term relationship than they are in nailing people down to a scope or a particular, say, statement of work. And they're focusing on building more trusting relationships, going collaboration over, say, negotiating a contract, but they still put in stone, harsh way of putting it, but they still document things such as available budget or some requesters for people's time. But then what is left to the the whims and to the whim of people is then actually what we end up doing within those boundaries. So they know they're going to get paid, and they know they're going to get paid for doing a job, but just what that job ends up being from an actual output perspective, they are much more relaxed about than say in the UK. And I guess maybe there are. It's hard to then know whether or not it is other, say, other countries that have that mentality, or do they just ask other countries to get into the scope and like normal contract game elements of it because they know what they think they know what we want. Because you're saying, say, South American with US, they'll do the kind of what we would call a traditional contract. But then if they're internally within South America, it'll be much more like you just explained. So then are we seeing that there are lots of organizations out there that get into contracts with certain countries or certain cultures and keep it in that traditional mechanism because they believe that's what they're going to ask for?
I think that's probably a fair observation. But again, if you're comparing, I mean, another set of cultures we could bring in here is from the Far East, the likes of Japan and Indonesia and Philippines to a lesser extent, where there's part of the culture is a regard for what time means, and part of our UK US culture, we see time as quite a linear thing. You know, we start projects and then there's an end project. And if you look at like cultures like Japan and Philippines, they kind of view time differently. They see it as a cyclical thing. The sun rises, it goes down again. The tides come in and out, and they're less focused on dates and deadlines and those sorts of things. It's like I say, they see things as this sort of cycle, this continuous cycle, if you see what I mean, which is quite difficult to kind of get your head around when you've kind of got your own perspective on time, for example. So yeah, like I say, if we go back to like UK, USA type cultures, it's like we're used to this idea of, I want to commission a project. I want this result by this date. I want this product delivered to me. That's how we're used to working. Whereas maybe in some of those South American, those Far East cultures, there was less of importance on that sort of, maybe that. I think it's still important, but again, it's just relative importance.
And as you said, it's the history of a country
Yeah,
which brings its culture too. So I don't know if certain teachings or philosophical ideals that different countries follow then change their perception of time. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's a sweeping statement, but if you believe in reincarnation, then you end up with a different outlook on life and different behaviors as a consequence, probably, than those that actually don't believe in that and think that there is an end and then we transcend and then that is it. So I'm guessing all that comes into effectively what is a country's culture and then how well they can work with something in the kind of product or agile space.
absolutely. And it comes back to outcomes as well, right? Like I said, when we're talking about contracts, part of why we have them in place is because we want something delivered by that date. And that's something that I see in the teams and organizations that I coach in my work, is shifting that mindset away of, what makes a great product. No product was great because it was delivered on time. It's because it fulfills a customer's or a user's need, right? So again, that's something that is embedded into our culture that maybe some of these other parts of the world have got less of a kind of barrier to jump over, if you see what I mean.
The elephant in the room on this is just what on earth does culture mean? Because I know that it's a big topic and we've just kind of jumped straight in and indulged ourselves somewhat by exploring some of the differences, cultural differences, and how they can relate to kind of collaborative, outcome-focused ways of working and building trust and relationships. But I guess for many people, we're thinking, well, yeah, great, but like I can never explain culture, or I haven't found a way to explain culture which sits well with me. So throughout your research, did you land upon a definition of culture that you were comfortable with?
I'll do my best, and I think it's important. Although in the book we're presenting it based on the countries that we visited, we've got to be. You mentioned an elephant in the room. One of the big elephants in the room is that we've got to be wary about stereotyping and saying, like, I don't know, all British people are reserved. Um, all of the Dutch people are direct. This is a big danger, right? And when we're talking about culture, we've got to acknowledge the idea of, well, we shouldn't really be stereotyping. This is something we were very conscious of as we were writing the book. Now, for me, we got to start thinking about culture as something as a very individual thing. There's lots of factors that are part of our culture, which we've kind of talked about. History, geography is one. But think about all of the things that make your culture as an individual unique. Where you were born, where you were raised, yes, but your profession plays a part. There's differences in culture between generations, um, between people with different religious beliefs. There's lots of different factors that make you unique as your culture. Yes, you might have a lot of factors that are common to your peers or people around you, but we got to think about what makes you as an individual, as a culture, and it's made up of all of those different factors. So, like I say, I'm a bit wary of
Mm.
making big generalizations and stereotypes, but at the same time, we wouldn't. These sort of characteristics, they must come from somewhere, right? Like if somebody told a joke and the punchline ended up with something like
Mm.
"and the German was late" or "the Swiss person was late," it wouldn't be funny, right? Because that's not the stereotype that we've got. So they kind of come from somewhere, right? Um, the point of all this is when we talk about culture, I think it's something that we can model, and this was the basis of our
Mm.
research. I mentioned the Hofstadter model earlier. There's another model called the Lewis model, which was the basis of our research. So just to give you a bit of background on that very quickly. So the Lewis model, whose creator was a person called Richard D. Lewis. He wrote a book called When Cultures Collide. And it's based on lots of research. He traveled all around the world, even more than we did. Something like 140 countries, I think he went to. He sent out loads of surveys, gathered lots of data. And again, he was just looking for patterns. And he created something called the Lewis model. And basically, there are groupings. His groupings is there's something called linear active, multi-active, and reactive. So these different cultural groups. And what he's saying is you as an individual can fit in one of these groups. So what we're saying is creating these cultural models, these classifications becomes a useful tool to help us start to understand each other. If I can take something like the Lewis model with a team of people and do an assessment and find out, right, this person falls into this, sort of displays characteristics from this category, a few from this one, I can kind of start to understand their cultural profile, but also I can understand the group of people within the team. And the first step to actually, if I step back a little bit, Richard D. Lewis's book is called When Cultures Collide. And a lot of the misunderstandings that we get into, you mentioned conflict earlier, we get into conflicts fundamentally because we're not on the same hymn sheet. We're not understanding each other. We've got misunderstandings. So if we can start to understand each other individually, each other's individual cultures, then we can start to bridge the gaps of understanding. So those classifications of this is what it's like in Germany, this is what's in UK is a useful starting point, but certainly not the end point. Like I say, we shouldn't be making those sweeping statements.
So, what are some of the characteristics then that it allows you to? What's the word? What's the correct term to use? Yeah, again, against then as individuals, what kind of things are it looking for?
So you've got the Hofstadter model, you've got the Lewis model. In the Lewis model, that's the one, like I say, that we used as the basis of our study. So it's things like comfort with ambiguity, as you mentioned. It's things like attitude towards hierarchy. In the Netherlands, there's a reputation for Dutch companies to be relatively flat. Social and professional intertwinedness, I suppose. So if I look at some of those South American cultures, to a lesser degree in the East, a lot of people, their workmates are their close friends and family. We do see that in countries like the UK, USA, but again, there's a clearer separation between people's professional lives and their social lives. So that's one thing as well. I mentioned some of Lewis's categorizations: linear active, multi-active. What is behind that is linear active categorization. People that fall in there, they like to do things one step at a time. They like to have a plan. Multi-active folks are, or the category, people that fall in the category, they are more comfortable with working in things in parallel. They're more comfortable with not having a clear plan up front. And there's communication styles come into this as well. So if I look at countries like maybe Finland, or very direct, very concise way of speaking, if you compare that to someone from Spain, for example, much more verbose, much more sort of animated in how they communicate as well. So communication patterns is another one. So yeah, there's about a dozen or so sort of core characteristics that Lewis uses anyway to form his
These
model.
characteristics, let me see if I can kind of conceptualize this correctly, is that we as individuals will either have inherited some characteristics which are part of our culture in our country, county, like country, small part, whatever it is, but we have certain stuff that we have inherited. And then there are times then people who, for whatever reason, haven't picked up on those cultural norms and then are different. Hence why there is no kind of golden rule. And yeah, it's wrong to stereotype because it does, because someone in the UK says the word interesting doesn't mean they might actually mean interesting, perhaps. So these are, I suppose, things which can be seen as characteristics and behaviors. But what we're not saying here is that no one is an individual and can't make their own mind up and choose to do or not do things or pick up influences from elsewhere and choose to adopt them. That actually, that is there like a cultural base which a lot of people then are building on. Is that a fair way to describe it?
I kind of see where you're coming from, but again, I think I think it's dangerous territory to make any sort of those sort of assumptions, right? I mean, I know people that I grew up with, and they're very different from other people in my peer group. So you can't really say it's geography. I've got some, people that when I was young, I remember my parents saying, like, I was almost born as if I was 40 years old. So it's not like there's a it's about generation, really. So I don't think there's one kind of cultural thing that we can say that's the base. Nationality, maybe, but even then, I think you're at risk of making too many assumptions or stereotyping.
Would it be fair to say that when we're talking about these cultural characteristics, they are, well, a healthy way of looking at it to say these are not in any way geographically or any way like race bound, but these are ways in which you can understand the composition of characteristics within a team?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and this is something we do towards the end of the book. Is I mean, we don't have the answers, but basically, there isn't like a crib sheet that we can give to teams and say, hey, this is your team makeup, this is how you should treat each other. But what we wanted to say is we should just be more aware that we're all unique, we're not machines, we've all got different ways of behaving. Nationality, where we're based, is a starting point. For example, if you go to Japan and you go to a business meeting, there's just some base things that you can kind of understand are going to happen. Like, it's very formal. In Japan, for example, meetings are all about ceremony and harmony. It's not really about debates or decision making, because again, the cultural aspect is avoiding conflict. That's one of the characteristics of the Lewis model, is how comfortable are individuals with conflict. And in a culture like Japan, again, you're not going to have a sort of conflict in meetings. So it's all very ceremonial. The real decision making happens outside of meetings, actually. So if I go into meeting, there's this whole process of, there's the whole thing with, you have to have business cards with you, and there's a particular way of meeting people, handing your business card over with two hands. If I take somebody else's business card and I put it in my pocket, I have just been really rude. So I have to take it, both hands, study it, look at the person, study it some more. Like, I'm really interested in what I'm looking at. So it's being aware of those sorts of points as a starting place. But like I say, it's just the start. And as I say, when it comes to working with teams and the diversity of teams that we have in the world, if we can avoid some of the misunderstandings that we have because we've got a better understanding of each other culturally, then that can only be a good thing for the collaboration.
If you were to say what was the biggest light bulb moment, biggest takeaway for you personally when you're going on this journey of creating this book, what would it be?
It's interesting because we've had this conversation around the stereotyping and the models, but it was interesting, and not in the British way. It was genuinely interesting to see the actual behaviors predicted by some of the models actually kind of come out. For example, part of the hypothesis for the study was, because South America was our first stop, are the people there, are they naturally more suited to Agile because they're naturally more collaborative? And we did see sort of things of how they work together, how they were much more sort of closer to each other as teams and closer to caring about their customers and their outcomes, those sorts of things. So probably the biggest thing, and again, this is why we kind of had this towards the end of the book. Spoiler alert! Using these models again. Look, there's the whole saying about all models are wrong, but some are useful. Just being aware of this stuff, just doing a little bit of cultural awareness can actually lead to something and greater understanding. There was something in these things.
I can attest to that. There was a book, not an Agile book, and there's a book I think I've spoken about on the podcast before that I read. It just enlightened me so much into how the differences in cultures and how people are raised and expectations and how that manifests in behaviors and their career choices. And there are some stereotypes that some of my Asian friends will say about themselves and about the pressure that they feel about to perform and the rest of it. And I'd never really kind of taken a lot of it on board enough, I think, in the past. So
Yeah. Let me give you another example, and I've worked with a lot of companies that outsource to countries like Vietnam, to India, and one of the frustrations that I hear is these people are not being transparent. They're not saying when they don't think they can hit a deadline, for example. They never say they never say no. Now, once you understand culturally where they're coming from, is again it goes back to kind of what I was saying with some of those aspects from Japan. Those are present in some of these other countries that I've mentioned. They don't want to be. They don't want to cause conflicts. They need to avoid conflict at all costs. They want to ensure that there's good harmony. So if you're asking them a direct question, do you think you're going to be done by August the 1st? Okay, to avoid conflict, they're going to say yes. So what we need to do is to learn to ask questions in a different way. So a very simple example, but changing that question to an open question, say, when do you think you're going to be done, is a more helpful way to have that conversation for both sides.
Useful tip there. Now, the avoidance of conflict is prevalent in many organizations, regardless, I found, of kind of which location or wherever you are. Lots of people out there aren't comfortable with conflict. And with a client today, we were exploring the word feedback, how actually the word feedback puts the fear into many people as well, because we tend to think it's not a positive thing. It's again, maybe it is, something that's unique to the UK or England, I don't know. But if someone says to you, I've got some feedback for you, it's never the best. Like, I've never met anyone like you. You are phenomenal. It's always basically like, you messed up or you're a bit of a shit, right? So, like, is there something then that in your book and just through people researching a lot of these things we've been talking about that we can say by learning about this, it helps just with any organizational culture where, let's say, there is a fear of conflict. There's some pointers or some tips in there for us to be able to better manage those situations, like you're saying with the open questions.
We don't go directly into conflict with this book. It's something we're expanding upon in our upcoming book out later in the year when we talk about facilitation. So, how do you facilitate and how do you deal with conflict? So, I think part of conflict is, it kind of goes in the context of our conversation. When we talk about when there's cultural differences, a lot of our misunderstandings are due to those differences that we've got, and a lot of the root cause is because we're just not understanding each other. We don't have empathy with each other. So, in my opinion, there's levels of conflict, and we can get to a level of conflict which is just unhealthy, and it can escalate and escalate and escalate. And part of it is, we're working together. Maybe it's you and me, Ben. You've got particular behaviors, particular needs that you've got, and I've got my own way of behaving, my own needs that kind of can contradict yours. If we understood each other when we first met, we could start to take account. If we can empathize with each other, we can take account for each other's needs and each other's behaviors, and kind of circumvent the conflict from happening in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
But if we go beyond a particular point, then the relationship becomes damaged. And I think there's a level of conflict where actually it's about you can do some things, take steam out, those sorts of things. But I think maybe prevention is better than cure in a lot of circumstances. But yeah, what do you do if you reach those levels of conflict? Again, it's like, what can we do? Let's take time out from what we're doing. There's tools like personal maps from Management 3.0. Let's just try to understand each other. So for me, it's about building empathy and understanding of each other's needs and behaviors.
Lovely. And I feel that kind of we can bring this to a little close now, because actually when I said it at the top, I think my understanding and way that I perhaps dealt with culture in the past was naive. It was because I didn't, I think, do enough to really accept some of the cultural differences that do exist. And that's how I'm perceived and how I am towards others. Never in any way which was abusive, right, or hurtful, but there was just a general level of naivety. But the one thing I always did and still do is build trust and respect and get to know people as individuals and learn more about their lives and where they're coming from and their hopes and dreams and expectations and how they want to communicate and work. And what I found was that, particularly when working with, there's a period of time when I was working in a place called Royal Bank of Scotland, working with lots of teams all over the world. I used to enjoy getting up at, and this is me being sarcastic, at 5 o'clock in the morning or earlier, and actually so I could spend time getting to know people. And I'm willing to learn about you and what you do. And if it's a religious holiday or a festival, then don't teach me about it. I want to learn. Let's make sure that we've got certain things in people's diaries, so we know when you're celebrating something, and when we're celebrating something. Let's learn and empathize and find that trust and respect as a common ground to then build our relationships from there. And I always found that was incredibly useful. But for too long, I felt that was enough, and I don't think it was.
Absolutely, and it's the same whatever the team makeup. I think if we can understand each other better, have empathy, then we're going to collaborate better and ultimately
perform better.
Produce better outcomes.
Let's use the dirty performance word. I said it. I'm not afraid of it. I mean, like, why build a team if you don't want to perform better than if they were a group? It's excuse my language. This is marked as E for explicit, so hopefully my kids will listen to it. But I think it's fucking ridiculous. Like, if we're going to build, gone.
And if I, and just to say one other thing, it's like, we form teams because, unless it's really a really simple job, we need groups of people to work together to solve problems. But when we're talking about diversity, the more the diversity of a team, you can bring the different experience, the different skills, the different perspectives from everybody, but it's you gotta manage it in such a way that people can be open, they can be participative. Like diversity without inclusion
Like,
is nothing.
is there any point to
And
that?
exactly. So, like I say, diversity in a group, it can lead to that performance, but without taking this into account, if we're just falling into conflict because we don't understand each other, then actually we're making things
And on
worse.
that lovely note, I need to think of another way. I have said on that bombshell, but it wasn't a bombshell. I was trying to think on that factoid, on that tip, on that thought. Oh, David, what's your thought of the day? Let's not stop. Don't get into thought of the day. Be asking for racing tips next. There you go. It's a cultural reference. Anyone who's listening to Radio 4 early in the morning, you know what I'm talking about. We'll bring this conversation to a close. And as a nice little teaser, like, for what's going to come, because we're going to be talking about, unless we change our mind in the next 5 minutes, product teams. Is that right, David? Few. Yeah. High performing product teams that consistently outperform their peers. What on earth does that mean? But then we're going to explore it because it's a great topic and one that I'm thoroughly excited about, and one that David might have written a book about because we've written so many of them. No, I'm really looking forward to it. It's going to be a great conversation. There's so many different areas we can go into with it, especially with, the worlds of product and agile kind of coming together, with Scrum spending so long, Scrum.org, Scrum Alliance, kind of doing these product owner certifications, which up until recently, or the last few years, I don't think they've really been at times quite good enough. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that. I think they kind of miss certain things. I think looking at a product owner team, can a product owner be a single person? Do we even need a product owner? What do you need in a team? Brilliant conversation that I can't wait to have with you, David.
Looking forward to it, Ben.
Woo! Okay, so we'll end this one here. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for listening.
Spinks. In episode 2, we are going to be exploring the topic of his first book around collaboration in product teams, because we want to know just what is a product team and what makes a good one. So for anybody you know, or even if it's yourself, who is in a product team, thinking about joining a product team, you want to know more, you want to know how to make it successful, some of the tips from an author on a book on the topic, then the next episode is just for you. So make sure that you subscribe to us on your podcast platform of choice. I will say thank you once again for listening. And my name is Ben Maynard, and this is the Product Agility Podcast.